Although many countries around the world are planning to develop their superior military strength, some countries even not has a high-powered defensive force. Sometimes some countries can't afford their military strength, or sometimes they don't need a strong military to protect their own country. And those data may surprise you. So let's see, which country has the weakest army in the world? North Macedonia. It's officially called the Republic of North Macedonia. This small landlocked country is situated in the Balkan Peninsula. The population of the country is just over 2 million, which has the area of land 380 times smaller than USA. There is no much to be surprised, as USA spends 7,000 times the money in which has been spent by Macedonia. Macedonia spends nearly $108 million to their army BT, keeping the aspect ratio from the budget as 0.85%, while it's very low when compared to the 1.3% of European average. But, USA spends 3.4% from their GDP for the military. When reading Macedonia's history, they has a great history of military. They has a history of conflicting with their neighbor country, Albania. But now, the small province the government allocate is hardly enough to maintain land army and small air force. As there is no ocean around the country, there is no any strength of naval militaries. They have 14 transport helicopters and 4 attack helicopters powered by just 13,000 military personnel, 5,000 of which are reserves. It seems North Macedonia won't be taking the world by force anytime soon. After all, when it comes to war, there's power in number of soldiers. But while the Macedonians keep their military spending is not proud or not enough. But in every year, they spend high to fly Santa Claus into the Skopje International Airport by a military Air Force helicopter. And those all Santa needs is to fire a rocket launcher to announce his arrival to the airport, and Macedonia will gain 1,000 military strength points on intimidation alone within the country. Bosnia and Herzegovina. They say diamonds are forged under pressure. But that doesn't really hold true for the armed forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This southeastern European country created an army right in the midst of the 1992 Bosnian War. The quick turnaround and limited access to supplies meant this country's army was made up from anyone they could get their hands on, including criminal gangs. Despite its reformation in the early 2000s, by spending little, things haven't improved much. Although Bosnia-Herzegovina does have a small section of 12 miles coastline at the end of one side of the country, this country has no any naval force or equipment needed for their security. Their air force has just only 19 helicopters, which are not actually designed for a defense force. So those are just helicopters by the name. Their land army is consisting with 10,500 active military soldiers, in which the strength is low for the defense. Although the structure of the country's armed forces allow the capacity for 6,000 soldiers in reserve, those reserves are allegedly non-existent. But anyway, the budget for the defense is near $165 million per year by their GDP, with that all lacking manpower. It's a relatively sizable military defense budget when compared. So, public used to question about the budget for defense. Because of it, this monetary value has drawn attention in recent years. Indeed, in 2012, Bosnia-Herzegovina's presidency chairman Milorad Tadic suggested to abolish the military defense, as a result of high spending with poor resulting performance. The armed forces ultimately stuck around, but when your own government begins arguing that your military is pointless, it's hardly the sign of a global powerhouse. Suriname. In the last 40 years, Suriname has experienced not just one but 2 kudetas to overthrow the government, as well as a civil war that have consequently brought the military to its knees. This is the one and only South America's Dutch-speaking country. And it has a severe lack of military boats, aircraft and even cars, with the minor equipment that it does have being largely decrepit and obsolete. Suriname's armed forces, made up of only 1,850 active personnel selected from the less than 600,000 total population, might be effective on a small scale, if it weren't for the lack of equipment, as the ration of military person to population is good. Currently the Suriname Air Force has just 3 service helicopters in its charge. For a long while the Navy and Coast Guard had 3 patrol boats that were purchased in the 70s which are not suitable to use for defense now. Until 3 new ones were purchased in 2012, they were so outdated that none of them were in service at all by the early 2010s. Since then Suriname has been reliant on the military donations of other nations to fulfill their defense necessity. Seeing as all those coups and internal conflicts also did a big bad effect on its economy. It's not surprising the Suriname's defense budget is only near 63 million with all those problems hitting their military. That budget is not even enough to buy one F-35 fighter jet for the Air Force. And how are you supposed to intimidate your enemies without a jet in their Air Force? It tells us the whole story about the defense of Suriname. Somalia. The African nation of Somalia has been gripped by civil war since the overthrow of its government in 1991. As you might expect, this has made organizing a military for the country a little tricky to say the least. While Somalia has an active official military of 20,000 personnel, that's nothing when compared to the size of its over 15 million people population. The part of the population belongs to fighting forces outside the official national armed military as the considering measurement of the internal conflicts. Rather than defending the borders of country, it's always using military's 100 armored vehicles and 10 tanks to fight against the civilian problems. Then you can imagine that this would put Somalia at a huge disadvantage if another nation were to attack, as the major problem against the armed force is their civilian war inside the country. Although Somalia has the longest coastline on the African mainland, until 2012 its navy was almost non-existent as a result of the civil war's destructive effect on most national institutions. In year 2012, however, the United Arab Emirates stepped in to help fund the Somalian naval force. But even with outside fundings, Somalia's defense budget is meager to supply the defense to the country. It's near $62.2 million. When it compare with USA's budget, it is over 12,000 times that amount at $750 billion in USA. Bhutan. Officially known as the Kingdom of Bhutan. Bhutan is more famous for its monks and monasteries than for its military forces. Although traditionally both of them look equally intriguing, being totally landlocked, this 15,000 square mile nation, which is just a little larger than the U.S. state of Maryland, has just 7,000 military personnel. As there is no any coastline around or inside the country, there is no any kind of navy and has never seen the need for tanks of any kind to protect the country. They have 2 helicopters and 27 armored vehicles to help keep the peace inside. In 2010, first time they met a war by fighting against a small group of neighboring Indian separatists. The army, which was then just 6,000 soldiers, only just managed to fight them off. And this incident caused to change their history. But being a country with few natural resources and mountainous terrain, Bhutan has the defensive perk of not really being worthy of invading. Safety through extensive armed forces or safety through being worthless to invade Bhutan? Let me know which defense tactic you prefer in the comments below. Costa Rica. As surprising as it might sound, the Republic of Costa Rica has actually survived without a real military for over 70 years following the end of a terrible civil war in 1948. The military was disbanded to ensure governmental forces would never brutally turn on Costa Rica's own citizens again. The public force of Costa Rica was established by replacing the military defense. This public force is consisting with units such as the Civil Guard and Air Vigilance Service. The public force consists of approximately 12,000 officers who are responsible for general enforcement, counter-narcotics and border patrol. That said, they're not exactly well equipped for maintaining order and protection. Until 2018 they only had 70 very basic limited-range vessels capable of patrolling the country's 800 miles of coastline. In 2018 year, the United States donated 3 patrol boats, 2 interceptors and 4 helicopters to make the strength of public force. But none of them are actually armed. Though despite having to rely on the hand-me-downs of other nations, there is an upside to having no military by not funding or maintaining expensive military equipment, training or personnel. Costa Rica is able to push more than 7% of its GDP into education. That's considerably higher than the USA's 5% and leads above the United Arab Emirates' 1.3% from their GDP. Costa Rica focus on education rather than militarization or defensive forces to establish and uphold a well-informed public, promoting stability within the country to prevent another civil war rise up from the public. When consider military sense, Costa Rica may be on the weaker side, but that don't mean it are not smart. Panama. Following the Costa Rica's example of abolishing military, country of Panama, famous for its vitally important waterway, abolished its military back in 1990, having been ruled by a military dictatorship for decades. The successive government disbanded its army and replaced it with the Panamanian public forces, just like Costa Rica's public force. This public force is consisting with national police, aviation, naval and border protection units, some of which do technically have warfare capabilities. But they're kept on an incredibly tight leash for a population of 3.8 million people in the country as the public force. There are only an estimated 10,000 active personnel, and despite being situated on one of the most important waterways which are used for business and transport in the world, the naval group has only 33 vessels, while 16 of these are dedicated patrol boats. The strength of air group isn't exactly flushed with supplies either, relying on just 23 helicopters for all works, a handful of which are dedicated to ambulance services. And finally, but not altogether surprisingly, Panama has a grand total of 0 fighter jets. It means there is no any military strength in the air. Even the armies of North Korea have access to fighter jets, although in fairness North Korea is in many ways the polar opposite to Panama. Its ultra-militarization can be identified by considering the allocating for military by their GDP to defense. But while North Korea packs more firepower, its beaches look like this, while Panama's beaches look like this, which have very eco-friendly and beautiful. I certainly know where I would rather live, and it doesn't involve fighter jets or this guy. Mauritius. Mauritius is an island situated in Indian Ocean, and it is very famous for its beautiful beaches and reefs than it is for its military strength or defense forces, or lack thereof, despite having one of the strongest economies in the geographical region of sub-Saharan Africa. As this is an island with 1.2 million people living, there are no bordering neighbors to threaten it with invasion. So border patrols are abolished naturally. And they also haven't any need of expanding its borders. Since they received the independence from Great Britain in 1968, Mauritius did not need to develop a regular or even reserve military. But they established a police force with 12,500 officers who are tasked with everything from Coast Guard patrols to riot control. But seeing as the island is more likely to be invaded by tourists than neighboring countries, the budget for the defense is near 22 million, which represent 0.15% of its overall GDP. So even with their police force containing a small paramilitary unit of around 1,400 soldiers, they're only reported to have invested in 6 police transport helicopters and 3 maritime patrol aircrafts. Their Coast Guard and the closest thing they have to a navy consist of just 15 patrol and strike boats, some of which were donated by the USA to make strength the forces. So it looks like we don't have to worry about Mauritius taking over the world anytime soon. But they have possessing 4 rocket launchers and 2 mortars in their forces. So don't get any ideas of staging a one-man kill. But do you know what is a perfectly safe choice for an individual? Hit those like and subscribe buttons to be continue with future videos of our channel, and go ahead declare war on those things. Iceland. In spite of being an individual from the military union of the North Atlantic Association, Iceland hasn't had a functioning or hold armed force since the last part of the 1800s. This prosperous pacifist country provides financial backing and civilian personnel for NATO. In any case, you won't perceive any military walks on Icelandic soil as a byproduct of their commitments. NATO countries furnish Iceland with military staff on a rotational premise. So any soldiers found on Icelandic region are more similar to transitory visitors with weapons. This implies Iceland can stand to scrimp on its safeguard spending simply 0.07% of its 25.88 billion GDP. That little hole primarily goes towards financing its coast guards, which are a small division comprised of around 120 people. Anyway, they actually doing a significant part in securing Iceland's enthusiasm adrift, with fishing making up an enormous bit of its economy so much. So, these peaceful islanders almost started a series of cod wars with the British throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s over disputed fishing territory to save their economy. Also, no, when I state cod war, I'm not discussing a fish battle until the death. Iceland only emerged victorious against Britain through diplomatic means. Since, in such a case that it had gotten into a fight, Iceland's minuscule nautical power would have been destroyed. Luxembourg. The little landlocked country of Luxembourg holds borders between France, Germany and Belgium. Even though it's famous for being a tax-dodging haven, taxes aren't the only conflicts it manages to avoid. Being so small and with over 40% of its 600,000 strong population being foreigners are the major reasons for it. Luxembourg's military forces are unobtrusive, no doubt. Being landlocked methods, the nation has no naval force at all. However, it has a little flying corps that presently has access to at least 2 multi-reason helicopters. In any case, the genuine snugness of Luxembourg's military wallet can be estimated by the size of its all-volunteer armed force, which goes to an aggregate of only 939 individuals. But when you break it down even further, you learn this number isn't just made up of soldiers, as the total number includes 137 civil staff, 81 officers and 54 musicians in the armed force. Actually, the Luxembourg Armed Force has more artists making up its formal groups than it does corporals coordinating the 428 deliberate fighters. So if France or Germany ever focused on little Luxembourg, we should trust a version of When the Holy People Come Walking In keeps them under control. Monaco. Regardless of flaunting huge financial plans for its government gambling clubs and yearly Equation 1 races, Monaco unquestionably isn't spending much on its defense or protection. Despite 32% of the population being made up of millionaires, the second smallest country in the world has no regular military force. Any significant issues of Monaco's protection fall into the lap of neighboring France. Yet, Monaco isn't totally exposed without its huge French brother. The sovereign state has 2 small military units. One is known as the Capitaine de Cabinet du Prince, which protects the prince and judiciary. The other, the Corps des Some People, is responsible for civil defense and firefighting. In spite of the fact that it's accounted for that Monaco has a joined military power of around 260 staff, around 140 of those make up its previously mentioned firefighting administration that leaves the whole nation with around 124 troopers, and they're generally utilized for ceremonial purposes. You could probably overcome that with 1 man, a gun and a donkey. Despite the lack of firepower though, somehow the worst part about Monaco's military is their rather peculiar-looking array of uniforms. Although it could always be worse, they could be part of the Vatican City's Swiss Guard or Iran's Army Hedge Camo Parade. But uniforms like those, it seems sometimes the best military a country can have is none at all. Put your ideas on how the military force of a country is affected with their growth. Let me know in the comment section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.